Well, thanks again for coming to this fourth training webinar for the Gardens Trust Green Futures project, which is supported by Historic England. And if you missed any of our previous webinars on nationally significant infrastructure projects and understanding setting, you can catch up via our resource hub. I'm Tamsin McMillan, the lead volunteer support officer at the Gardens Trust, and I'm running this project with Frankie Taylor, who you can see in the little window, and she is our engagement officer. If you came to our last webinar 2 weeks ago, you'll have heard me talking about the setting of historic designed landscapes, what it is, how it covers more than just views, and how important understanding and conserving setting is to conserving the significance of a landscape. Today we'll learn how, in conservation terms, setting is absolutely key to the protection of historic parks and gardens, and we'll look at the range of significances that an historic park or garden can have, how to distill those into a statement of significance, which gives a rapid understanding of just what makes a site important. And as we're about to see, the concept of significance and the pursuit and use of something called statements of significance runs throughout conservation work. So it's one thing to spend months or years researching a site so thoroughly that we generate hundreds of pages and can say where every plant and every path was and the precise dates of every owner. But in order to make that research relevant and useful for today's conservation scene, we really need to be able to condense and edit that information into a pithy description of its significance. And this is what statements of significance are. You could think of it as an executive summary for a site that describes key facts based on their implications for meaningfulness. We're going to be taking questions at the end of this presentation. Please type them into the chat as you think of them, and we'll be sending you a link to the recording and a PDF of the slides, which will also be on the resource hub of our website. So just on to a little summary of what we'll be covering today. I'll start off by giving some headlines on the broad concepts of what significance is in relation to conservation. Then I'll talk a little about the kinds of situations where significance or statements of significance are used as a tool, and we'll look at where it comes into the National Planning Policy Framework. Then we'll look at how to assess significance, and then how to write statements of significance with a couple of examples. So significance stars in the definition of conservation set out by the NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework. And that's a policy from the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, which guides local authority planning decisions. And it defines conservation as the process of maintaining and managing change to a heritage asset in a way that sustains and, where appropriate, enhances its significance. So clearly, significance is key here. Conservation is not simply about preserving the asset's physicality exactly as it is, but rather something more sophisticated than that. It's about protecting specifically what's special. Of course, that means special, not just what's best, what we like best. And we have to be a bit firm with ourselves in deciding what is special or significant, so we don't just choose the bits that appeal to our sense of taste. The wording about the appropriate management of change refers to the fact that conservation is not about preserving things exactly as they are. Instead, we should use an understanding of significance as a tool that enables us to protect what's important, whilst accommodating changes that may benefit and perhaps help us to enjoy the heritage asset more. So I can't emphasize enough, I will keep saying it, significance is at the heart of methodology for the protection of historic parks and gardens. So what is it? I think the easiest way to think about it is it's the difference between the history of a site and what is important about the site. Think of it like these two bags in this rather ridiculous AI picture. One is huge and can contain absolutely everything you own or everything you know about a site. It's fantastic to have, but it makes actual ongoing life quite tricky. You can't really move with it. The other bag is small and manageable. It contains the select favourite or most important things that you choose to carry around to make life happen. So this represents the selection of what's really important about a site that we need to know in order to manage and conserve it. The official way of describing significance for heritage policy, in terms of the planning system, is that it is the value of a heritage asset to this and future generations because of its heritage interest. And this interest may be archaeological, architectural, artistic, or historic. Significance derives not only from a heritage asset's physical presence, but also from its setting. Understanding what is significant about a landscape can help us to assess the impact of a development on that landscape. Remember, conservation is about managing change to a site's significance rather than necessarily preserving it in aspic. A planning application may not be to our taste, but by recognising a site's true significance, we may be able to establish that, for example, a large new extension in a pretty 1970s rose garden of an 18th century house with a Humphrey Repton landscape around the other side may not be as devastating as we thought. Conversely, we may realise that a new footpath that has just been put in the middle of the Humphrey Repton view may actually have far more of a detrimental impact on the site's real value and significance than a much larger development that is convincingly part of the site's story as a private home. Being able to assess a development against a site's significance rather than just whether it's new or big will allow us to help manage rather than prevent change, prompting ourselves to be pragmatic rather than dogmatic in our conservation work. That's not to say that significance allows a way to make excuses for development. Rather, it's a way to make sure we're focused in our judgments. And here's an example on the screen. This is the Queen Pool at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. It's part of the 18th century landscape designed by Lancelot Capability Brown. You can see the palace on the hilltop to the right, and Vanbragh's famous bridge is just off the image to the right. So here, I've used AI to mock up a rather imposing new garden eye-catcher building, which I've placed on the lake shore to the left. What do we think about this addition? And here, I've added quite a large interpretation panel in the foreground explaining the view and the history of the site. So one of these would probably make us panic a little bit if we got the planning application, and the other might not. But which one actually causes the most visual damage? Which is more incongruous in this important view? Perhaps they both are. I'll just leave you that as something to think about. So next we're going to look at some slides to show how statements of significance, or at least an understanding of significance, can be used, partly in terms of responding to the NPPF, but in other ways too. So before we leap in, I'm conscious that I'm going to keep referring to statements of significance, but haven't actually covered them yet. So I'll just quickly explain that they're basically just the brief texts that you write up, in which you write up the site's significance. Anyone can write one. There's no global agency to approve or reject them, although obviously if you want to lodge it somewhere official, you'll need to get the agreement of the managers of the repository. So how would you use the concept of significance in your everyday work around historic parks and gardens? Even if you're not interested in planning and conservation, the ability to determine significance will be useful in activities like tours, lectures, and leaflets, like this series of guided walks leaflets shown here, produced by Hertfordshire Gardens Trust. Essentially, researched information can have a much greater impact if the key hooks of a site, so what makes it special, are drawn out, rather than simply presenting readers with every word of your lifetime's research. This is user-friendly interpretation. But the Gardens Trust is a statutory consultee in the planning system, and we always have an eye firmly on conservation. So let's look again at the NPPF. So that's a policy, as I've said before, that guides the work of the Planning Inspectorate and local authority to make planning decisions. Significance crops up the whole way through section 16, which is the heritage section of the NPPF. It's absolutely at the heart of planning policy for historic parks and gardens protection. Here are a few paragraphs, a few key ones. It does occur elsewhere too. And these ones talk about the importance of understanding the significance of a site. So paragraph 202 says that heritage assets are an irreplaceable resource and should be conserved in a manner appropriate to their significance so that they can be enjoyed for their contribution to the quality of life of existing and future generations. So significance must be made clear to decision makers, and this is spelled out in paragraph 207, which says, in determining applications, local planning authorities should require an applicant to describe the significance of any heritage assets affected. The level of detail should be proportionate to the asset's importance, and no more than is sufficient to understand the potential impact of the proposal on their significance. As a minimum, the relevant historic environment record should have been consulted. So please note this reference to the historic environment record, and we'll look more at HERs shortly. So you can see that applicants need to demonstrate that their proposal comes after an understanding of the site's significance, has informed it, but also that local authorities need to understand the site's significance. Paragraph 208 of the NPPF says that local planning authorities should identify and assess the particular significance of any heritage asset affected by a proposal, including by development in the setting. They should take this into account when considering the impact of a proposal to avoid or minimise any conflict between the asset's conservation and any aspect of the proposal. So just to note that this all includes setting, as we discussed in the last webinar. So, for example, if you have a look at these images, if there was a proposal for a warehouse in this distant view from Brockhole in Cumbria, which you can see at the top, both the applicant and the local authority would need to understand the significance of that development on Brockhole and its setting, just as much as they would do for this zip wire visitor attraction that's within Brockhole itself in the bottom picture. The effect of development proposals on historic parks and gardens significance is how we measure impact and whether the impact is great enough that the proposal should be refused. So, paragraph 214 says that where a proposed development will lead to substantial harm or total loss of significance of a designated heritage asset, planning authorities should refuse consent unless it can be demonstrated that the substantial harm or total loss is necessary to achieve substantial public benefits that outweigh that harm or loss. So they'd have to be extremely significant benefits to outweigh the loss. Let's just look for a minute at this concept of harm. So it's measured as being either substantial or less than substantial. A proposal could also have no impact on significance or may indeed enhance significance. And you need to be able to clearly articulate what level of harm you believe a proposal has. Remember that harm is to the significance of the landscape, not necessarily to its physical fabric. This image is of the glamping site at Warwick Castle. Medieval glamping at this area called Fox's Study at Warwick Castle is really quite at odds to the significance of this area. Fox's Study was planted in the picturesque style in the late 18th century and forms a calm transition between the gardens and the park, and would have been a mixed plantation of trees with an understory of shrubs interlaced with winding paths. So the introduction of glamping tents and pods is arguably substantial harm or even total loss of significance, and therefore it should have been refused consent. And all this applies even if the site is non-designated, and most of the sites that we're going to be looking at in the Green Futures project will be non-designated. Although there is more leniency in planning with non-designated sites. We're going to be talking about designations in a later webinar, so for now let's just say that a reference to a site being designated would mean that it was on the National Heritage List, so perhaps either on the Register of Parks and Gardens of Special Historic Interest, or having another type of protection, such as being a scheduled monument or a World Heritage Site. Non-designated sites are ones which are still of some importance, but locally rather than nationally, but are not designated at the national level. The effect of an application on the significance of a non-designated heritage asset should be taken into account in determining the application, says paragraph 216 of the NPPF. And in weighing applications that directly or indirectly affect non-designated heritage assets, a balanced judgment will be required, having regard to the scale of any harm or loss and the significance of the asset. So this need to measure an application against the impact on significance applies to sites that aren't on the Register of Parks and Gardens, so long as they've been in some way identified by the local planning authority. And the picture here is of Barn Hill in Wembley. It's an unregistered park that includes a remnant of a Humphrey Repton landscape. If there was a proposal to put a car park or a leisure centre in it, the local planning authority would have to assess that against the site's significance. Now, the key document it would be useful for you to look at if you'd like to know more is Historic England's Advice Note 12 called Statements of Significance. And I think Frankie's going to pop the link into the chat box for you. It particularly covers significance in relation to the NPPF and includes a step-by-step process for working out significance. So it's really useful and a very clear guidance note to have a look at. Let's now remind ourselves of the NPPF's reference to historic environment records, or HERs, and find out a little bit more about them. So HERs are a county-based collection of information, and it can be both textual and mapped, covering thousands of archaeological sites, fieldwork, and other elements of the historic environment of the country. The map on the right here is from Nottinghamshire HER and shows the 303 records they have for historic parks and gardens, both registered and non-designated. The image on the left is a screen grab of part of an entry. So each record attempts to gather all the different designations and features of the heritage asset. HERs collect material from lots of different sources, including specialist academic groups, such as County Gardens Trust research groups. They have two main uses. Firstly, as material for academics and researchers, but probably more importantly, to inform planners and planning decisions. Not all HERs are free to access, though many, but not all records are available via the Heritage Gateway website. By the way, just if I refer to any links, I'll just let you know that they will be in the script that you'll be getting for this presentation. They'll all be included. So HERs are used by local planning authority officers to help inform their decisions, and they function best when they have a statement of significance to represent them. So if we can put our research onto the HER with a statement of significance, we're giving it wings as a conservation tool. When a planner receives a planning application, you'll remember that the NPPF requires them to assess it against the asset's significance, against the site's significance. Paragraph 205 says that local planning authorities should maintain or have access to an historic environment record. This should contain up-to-date evidence about the historic environment in their area and be used to assess the significance of heritage assets and the contribution they make to their environment. And paragraph 206 says that local planning authorities should make information about the historic environment gathered as part of policy making or development management publicly accessible. So the planning authorities are obliged to put information onto the HER too. So once the planner receives the planning application, they'll need to know more about the heritage asset and probably in a hurry, and they'll go to the HER as their main port of call. Planners are pretty much always busy, stretched, under-resourced, and usually historic design landscapes aren't their specialist subject. They'll not have time to read a dissertation and make their own judgment call on a site's significance. So if you can head your research with a brief statement of significance, the planner can understand it immediately and use it exactly where it's needed in assessing the application. If we've ensured that the very best information is in the HER, then we will have armed our planners with the tools they need to assess and perhaps advise upon or reject that application. So this is a really good argument for making sure that your wonderful research doesn't only get put onto your website or even into a lovely coffee table book, but always gets put onto the HER. Clearly, if we can assess and summarise significance as part of our research, and can make that available through the HERs, our research can have a direct application in the conservation of historic designed landscapes, which is incredibly important. If you'd like to see a couple of examples of county gardens trusts that have done a really good job of putting their research onto HERs with statements of significance, I can really recommend looking at the websites of Yorkshire and Buckinghamshire Gardens Trust, but there are lots of others too. Statements of significance can also help us explain the value of a site concisely for local plans, both to help us persuade the local authority officer putting together the local list of sites of importance, of the value of each site, but also within each site entry. Local plans often have local lists, and these are lists of sites of local importance. This is a really valuable way to offer some protection to sites that aren't on the National Register, so they aren't nationally designated, but they may perhaps have real local value. Although, to be clear, sites don't have to be on a local list to have some protection if they can be recognised by the local planning authority as non-designated assets in some other way. By working with local planning authorities, county gardens trusts can help to create these lists of local sites of importance. And this list can be attached to a local plan, offering some degree of protection in the planning system. But no local planning authority is going to have time to listen if you go and dump 100,000 words of research on their desk and ask for it all to be locally listed. What they're going to listen to is if that research is carefully compiled and each entry includes a statement of significance, so they can see quickly exactly why each site has value. So incidentally, local lists don't have to be in local plans, and they're useful documents even if they stand alone. Again, Yorkshire Gardens Trust and Buckinghamshire Gardens Trust, and also Kent, have done some really excellent work on contributing to local lists, and you can see this if you have a look at their websites. So we've looked at how significance can help you assess a development proposal. Think back again to the new garden temple and the interpretation sign at Blenheim as an example. This understanding of significance also needs to be carried into comment letters on planning applications, like those submitted by volunteers in the County Gardens Trusts, or by the Gardens Trust and Historic England as statutory consultees for registered historic parks and gardens. Remember the NPPF and how much weight you're allowed to give impact on significance in commenting on an application. In the NPPF, the local planning authority is required to assess the impact of the proposals on the significance of the site. So if they can't identify what's significant about the site and show that the impact is not serious, permission should be refused. If consultees can set out in their comments on planning applications how the proposal will impact significance, they make it much easier for planners to successfully protect historic parks and gardens. The Gardens Trust template letters for County Gardens Trust volunteers to use when commenting on planning applications, which you can see here, include a place to relate the proposal to significance. And this is the standard best practice. You can just see it at the top of page 2 there, the first couple of paragraphs. And as a reminder, you can get these template letters from our online resource hub. They follow a model where you explain the significance and then you explain the impact of the proposal on that significance. So if you're responding to a planning application and you have a statement of significance to hand that either you or a County Gardens Trust researcher perhaps has written, or it's in the HER, then you can just drop it into this letter, having gone through the process of questioning the proposal against it. If there isn't already a statement of significance, then you can write one using your knowledge of the site, even if the knowledge is not as extensive as you would like. Just a reminder, though, that for the Green Futures project, we'll not be expecting volunteers to be compiling responses to NSIP applications themselves. Instead, their research reports and the statements of significance which emerge from them will be available via the HERs to help statutory consultees write their letters and planners to make informed decisions. So how do you assess significance? Well, just a reminder that anyone can come to a conclusion about a site's significance and even write a statement of significance. Like anything in life, some will be better than others, but that's okay. There's no mechanism for approving a statement of significance, so you could quietly write one for your own use for a particular site without having to check it with any agency. But if you want it to be used somewhere like an HER or a local plan, then at that stage, you'll obviously need to be liaising with the person who looks after that resource. So my local HER officer in Nottinghamshire says that each HER record is broken down into the following: an event record. And this details how information was gathered for the Park and Garden record. So in this case, it would be via the Green Futures project. Secondly, a source record. This would be a list of any reports, documents, etc. produced for the project and produced during the research, including a statement of significance. So it's just a reference, a list of those sources. And then the meaty bit, this is the monument record. This includes any data relating to the Park and Garden, which could include the statement of significance. The HER officer might pull out key bits of information from the report or from the statement of significance, but the whole statement of significance can also be attached to the record as a digital file for users of the system. And then a designation record, lastly. If there are any designations associated with the Park and Garden, the HER officer would update these and link them to the project. Nottinghamshire HER doesn't ask for any set format for a statement of significance. But for this project, we'll need to check if this is also the case with the HERs in the Eastern region. So how do we know what the significance of a site is? Well, the NPPF offers a set of interests that can be applied to cultural heritage to tease out its significance and get us thinking about sites in a specific way. You look at a site and you pick out which of these heritage interests it holds, and the blend of them together equals the significance. The heritage interests that the NPPF uses are listed here: archaeological, architectural and artistic, and historic. And I'll just read to you now how it describes each of them, and then we'll go through each one separately and talk through it more in everyday language. So there is archaeological interest if the heritage asset holds or potentially holds evidence of past human activity worthy of investigation at some point. Architectural and artistic interest are interests in the design and general aesthetics of a place. They can arise from conscious design or fortuitously from the way the heritage asset has evolved. More specifically, architectural interest is an interest in the art or science of the design, construction, craftsmanship, and decoration of buildings and structures of all types. Artistic interest is an interest in other human creative skill, like sculpture. And historic interest is an interest in past lives and events, including prehistoric ones. Heritage assets can illustrate or be associated with them. Assets with historic interest not only provide a material record of our nation's history, but can also provide meaning for communities derived from their collective experience of a place, and can even symbolize wider values such as faith and cultural identity. So it does sound a bit complex, a bit wordy. In legislation and designation criteria, the terms special architectural or historic interest and of a listed building and national importance of a scheduled monument are used to describe all or part of what in planning terms is referred to as the identified heritage asset's significance. So in other words, in the Register of Parks and Gardens, the special historic interest actually means special significance. The significance is a blend of all the interests which the site fulfills. Do note that the site doesn't have to fulfill all of these interests, but they do form a useful checklist for you to go through when you're considering where the site's significance lies. And these interests can be applied to the landscape as a whole or to its constituent parts. So significance is the value of a heritage asset to this and future generations because of its heritage interest. And the interest may be archaeological, architectural, artistic, or historic. Now we're going to just quickly consider each of these heritage interests briefly in turn with a few examples. So archaeological interest. So just a reminder that that is if the heritage asset holds or potentially holds evidence of past human activity worthy of expert investigation at some point. So archaeological interest relates to the potential of a place to reveal new information that's of value. This is an image of Hampton Court, and we could say that one of the ways that Hampton Court is significant is its archaeological interest and its potential to reveal still more information about the development of Royal Palace Gardens. Obviously, that's a really big name example, but the same could just as easily apply to a less familiar landscape and less dramatic archaeology. For example, an 18th century parkland with an Iron Age fort underneath. But don't forget that evidence about past human activity needs to be worthy of expert investigation. So you can't just use any old thing. It's better to base this interest on known or recent surveys or research. Architectural interest is about the design and aesthetics inherent in the heritage asset. Don't be confused. It doesn't need to mean architecture as in a built item. It can include trees, flower beds, paths, contouring, lakes, any designed garden feature. An architectural interest can be the result of the conscious design, primarily the qualities generated by the design of a building, park, or garden, but can also be the apparently fortuitous outcome of the way in which a place has evolved over time and been used over time, i.e. without design. So you might perhaps describe the architectural interest of this parkland in the image here as the arrangement of large mature trees planted to reveal and frame views under their broad canopies. Artistic interest is an interest in other human creative skill. In other words, it can also be about the design and aesthetic interest of something that's been added to the heritage asset, such as a piece of sculpture, like this statue at Highfield Park in Nottinghamshire, gifted by the university's Ningbo campus in China and representing the friendly relationship between the two campuses. But don't be confused, artistic doesn't mean it has to be art. In my opinion, the distinction between architectural and artistic is a really difficult one for landscapes, which can be so layered. And where the sculpture, or whatever it is, can have been an integral part of the overall design from the beginning. It doesn't really matter, though, if you can't distinguish between architectural or artistic, as helpfully they're all bundled together, so don't worry too much. And as with architectural interest, the aesthetic interest can be conscious or fortuitous, and that doesn't really matter. So historic interest, defined as an interest in past lives and events, lies in the potential to tell stories about the past using the site as a key to unlock a narrative. The NPPF says that heritage assets can illustrate or be associated with historic interests, and that such heritage assets not only provide a material record of our nation's history, but can also provide meaning for communities derived from their collective experience of a place and can symbolise wider values such as faith and cultural identity. So we'll look at this distinction of how heritage assets can illustrate or be associated with them, because that does sound a bit confusing at first. But first, let's just unpick the concept of meaning for communities, as it's a thread that runs through historic interest. So community meaning derives from all the other meanings that people assign to a place. It's not the same as community, and it isn't as basic as public access. It's often expressed as a sense of belonging and can have a profound effect on local identity. So the picture here shows Calverley Grounds in Tunbridge Wells in Kent. It's a public park well used for recreation by the local community for many generations, and it's a great source of civic pride. It's an obvious example of community meaning. But don't forget, community meaning isn't as simple as public access or ownership. Take, for example, Buckingham Palace. Most of us will never visit, but nevertheless, it has a huge community meaning as home to our monarch, and the location of historic national events. People gather there at times of importance, national importance. And other sites with considerable community meaning would also include cemeteries and memorials for obvious reasons. An awareness of community needs to thread through our assessment of historic interest. Illustrative historic interest has the power to demonstrate some historical point, or to narrate an historical story, or to evoke the past. So you could say that this orangery at Mount Edgecombe in Cornwall illustrates the popularity of ornamental buildings to grow exotic fruit undercover in the 18th century onwards. So that's the story that it tells. A quick word on how community meaning can relate to illustrative historic interest. So St Anne's allotments in Nottingham have community meaning in terms of they're showing the collective interest in allotment growing, which has always been a community activity. Arguably, it has a stronger community meaning than the Fenton House Kitchen Garden in London, for example, which is now accessible and run by a charity for the benefit of the nation, but was originally the private garden of a merchant's house, and so only tells the story of vegetable growing in private houses, and therefore has less community meaning. Associative interest arises from association with a notable person, event, or movement, because being at the place where something momentous happens can really increase our understanding and appreciation of it. Many buildings and landscapes are associated with people, literature, art, music, or film, for example. And the Royal Pavilion in Brighton, shown here, has historic interest in its associated connection with George IV. The Royal Pavilion, also known as the Brighton Pavilion, is a Grade 1 listed former royal residence in Brighton. Beginning in 1787, it was built in 3 stages as a seaside retreat for George, Prince of Wales, who became the Prince Regent in 1811 and King George IV in 1820. We can probably all think of landscapes that are connected to an historically important figure, including designers. So associative historic interest is a really big one for historic landscapes. A quick word on how community meaning can relate to associative historic interest. The community meaning for Blenheim as the birthplace of the Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who saw Britain through the Second World War, is probably going to be higher than, say, Stowe, even though they're both open to the public, and indeed Stowe is owned by the National Trust for the benefit of the nation, whereas Blenheim is just owned by the Duke of Marlborough as a private home. This picture is of Chequers, and an interesting question is to consider where Chequers fits into this. I'd say it has a high associative community meaning as the country residence for Britain's prime ministers, even though you can't visit it as a member of the public. And there are few historic landscapes which are actually so difficult to get close to. Yet I'd say it has a high community meaning in terms of its association with this nation's elected leaders. Let's now move on to the final section, which is how to write a statement of significance. So it's useful to have a mechanism or process in order to put our thoughts into some sort of system about what values apply. And the table here is just an example of one manageable way to think about assessing significance. It's a rather mechanistic process. You divide a site into different areas, for example, these ones listed here, and then you fill in each value box, leaving those blank where the site doesn't fulfill a certain heritage value. So perhaps your site, you don't think it has any archaeological value, so you just leave that blank. When complete, you could turn it into prose text. So a reminder about when we turn this into prose, we're really not looking for lengthy tomes, and there are no quizzes for high word counts. That kind of detailed writing does have its place, but when dealing with significance, we're looking for a short, pithy summary of the main points. A couple of paragraphs is ideal. So what this table shows is that you could start with a whole estate and then break it down into areas or even features. It depends on the level of detail that you're looking for. Oops, sorry. Don't forget, you wouldn't expect sites to necessarily have something for each of the heritage interests. You go through them all to ensure that your approach is methodical and fair, but you may well decide that it doesn't carry all the heritage interests. And for our Green Futures project, we're going to use a fairly simple template like this to understand significance of our sites. But you might prefer this form instead, either using one of these boxes, one of these forms for each feature, or looking at the site as a whole. Obviously, these are just representations of how you might want to make your notes, and you can do it in whatever way suits you best. For example, having this on one page might be for your initial notes, and then you might want to make a whole new page for more detailed notes on each interest. So next, you write it into a text. You don't need the headings in the actual statement of significance, because readers should be able to tell which historic interest you're referring to. Sometimes significance can even be rated for further understanding of its importance. For example, the National Trust is introducing a system to rank the degree of significance of a heritage asset or elements of the asset. And I think they use something like 6 categories. The highest is exceptional, i.e. the best examples of their class, down to the lowest, which is called detrimental, due to being visually intrusive or damaging in some other way. Don't worry, this is not something that we're going to be attempting for the Green Futures project, but it is a useful tool to help organisations like the National Trust to understand and manage the sites they curate. So don't forget there's also great advice in the HE advice note on the Statement of Heritage Significance, which I mentioned earlier, which you have a link to. Right, a warning. Please don't try and read these words. They're just put up as an example to show you the length of a statement of significance. So there's no real right or wrong for how to write up a statement of significance. I'm just going to run you through some examples here, but please don't think that they're templates. They're really not. One of the things that I want you to take from these examples is that you don't have to, as I mentioned, and perhaps it's better if you don't actually keep the headings of the heritage interests within the statement of significance. You can use the headings to write it, but then take them out and restructure it in a way that works for you as flowing prose. Conversely, though, if you do refer to heritage interests in your statement of significance, or in your correspondence with local planning authorities, if that's something that interests you, you can help planners who may not be garden or even historic environment literate to apply what they do know about, i.e. planning and planning terms, to landscapes, and thus help protect them. You're using the heritage interests to translate your garden history knowledge into something that planners can understand and use. So we're going to use Temple Newsam in Yorkshire as an example. More recent entries in the Historic England Register of Parks and Gardens include a bullet point list of reasons for designation. You might have come across these yourselves. And I'd say that these lists read very much like something that's been arrived at after someone's gone through the process of considering the heritage interests, even though they're not generally labelled that. So this is taken from Temple Newsam's register entry, and I'm just going to quickly read it out for you. So reasons for designation. The Historic Park and Garden at Temple Newsam is registered Grade 2 for the following principal reasons. Historic interest. It reflects changing tastes and fashions in garden design during the 18th century, blending formal and informal, and redesigning and remodelling earlier gardens. So this is the illustrative historic interest. Hype. It's a good example of an 18th century landscape park and pleasure grounds, a landscape type that was hugely influential across Europe and North America and is considered to be one of England's most significant contributions to art and design. So that's an illustrative historic interest. Designers. It's largely the work of William Etty, a notable architect, and Lancelot Capability Brown, England's most influential designer of informal landscapes, who both worked on the landscape in separate phases during the 18th century. So this, you might have guessed it, is associative historic interest. It's mentioning people. Design interest. Its informal parkland landscaping retains key signatures of Brown's work and highlights the influence of Claude Lorrain's 17th century paintings of ideal landscapes on its designs. Elm Walk, Sycamore Walk and Etties the Avenue remain as important survivors of the estate's earlier, more formal schemes. So I'd say this is illustrative historic interest, but perhaps also has a little architectural interest in it too. Group value. It has strong group value with the main house of Temple Newsam, as well as the neoclassical stable block, numerous Grade 2 buildings at Home Farm, North Lodges, etc., etc. So perhaps you could say that this is a blend of illustrative historic interest and that it demonstrates the various key features of a certain type of 18th century landscape, and architectural interest in that it looks at different things that you can see in the landscape and how they work as a whole for aesthetic effect. Again, please don't try and read this, just there to show you the length. So this is a statement of significance that we wrote up for Temple Newsam to show the kind of short statement that you might want to include in a planning comment letter, if that's something that you're involved with as a volunteer. To be honest, you might even want a shorter one. So I'll just quickly read it out. And you can see how it differs to the previous statements. The significance of the landscape of Temple Newsam lies chiefly in the way it sheds light on the design approach of the foremost landscape designer, Lancelot Capability Brown, in spite of his design not having been fully implemented. His rides, planting and management of views show him working with and adjusting the natural topography to aesthetic and dramatic effect. Whilst no longer intact, the landscape design incorporates features characteristic of Brown's work, with sweeping lawns, varied woodland, scenic drives, and classical temple eye-catcher, in places adapting Etty's earlier work. The integrity of the Brownian landscape is particularly compromised by the loss of a large area to the west, which was given over to open cast mining from the 19th century up to the 1960s, and was subsequently poorly restored. However, the open cast mining of a Brownian landscape was conceivable. That open cast mining was conceivable, demonstrates the comparatively low value then attached to association with Brown, who is today recognised to be amongst the great names of landscape architecture worldwide. Even in this area, pockets of Brown's planting scheme might still be found. And then, definitely don't read this one, you might want an A4 page or so version to go with your research and into the HER. And this is a longer version of the previous. I'm not going to read it all out, don't worry, but I'm just going to read a few key phrases to show how they address the heritage interests. The significance of the landscape of Temple Newsam lies chiefly in the way it sheds light on the design approach of the foremost landscape designer, Capability Brown. So this is historic interest, which is both associative and illustrative. His rides, planting and management of views show him working with and adjusting the natural topography, sweeping lawns, a temple, placement of buildings, woodland planting. Now, this is going on about architectural and artistic interest. Etty's treatment of the bridge and avenue ponds bears witness to the contemporary engineering limitations to hydrological works and bridge design. And that's a story, really, so that's illustrative historic interest. Archives indicate that Brown's designs for the Menagerie Lakes were probably never implemented. And then it gives some information about those water bodies. This is illustrative historic interest, even though the small water bodies were only partially or perhaps not implemented at all. It doesn't matter, it's still a story, it still is illustrative interest. The floriferous walled kitchen garden with its extensive glass houses continues to illustrate the long history of horticultural practice. It also talks about native collections and species. So that's illustrative historic interest again, talking about an interest in plants, bringing plants into the collection. The next point is, within the parkland lie the earthworks of a shrunken medieval village. So that's very obviously archaeological interest. Small-scale memorial planting in this area has created places of some significance for the relatives of those commemorated. So this is a more local thing that's giving historic interest that has community meaning. The integrity of the Brownian landscape is compromised by the loss of a large area to mining. This is illustrative historic interest again, because even damage to the heritage asset can be part of its story, part of its heritage significance. So that's very long, and that's not what you'd call a statement of significance, but it's probably still quite a concise summary of a whole research report. So we're nearly there. Just to finish up, let's have a very quick recap about the introduction to understanding significance. I'll just run through it. So we've said all the way through, significance is key to the protection of design landscapes within planning. Developers must describe it in their applications, and planners must be able to understand it. Conservation is about managing change to significance, and change can sometimes be beneficial. Significance can be described as the difference between the whole history of a site and what is important about the site. It describes the value of a heritage asset under the categories of architectural, archaeological, artistic, and historic. It can also derive from setting, and changes in the setting can affect significance positively or negatively. Statements of significance should be brief texts which quickly summarize the heritage interests. And understanding what's significant can help us to assess the impact of potential development and make pragmatic decisions about the future. Sharing statements of significance via the HER or another platform is crucial to conservation through planning, designation, and local listing. I'm just going to leave you with this image, which I think is a good visual landscape representation of a statement of significance. So it's very simple. There's no undergrowth, no useful but distracting benches or signage, no well-meant flower beds, no disorganized self-seeded growth. The view is simple, but its components well chosen and well maintained. And as a result, it's harmonious and easy to see what's going on and appreciate the contents from the carefully designed path that navigates the whole to steer you to the best view at the end there through the gate. So we hope that your statement of significance will be something simple and easy to understand like that image. Thank you very much. I'll just tell you that the next webinars coming up will be with the Gardens Trust Sally Bate, and they'll be on how to research an historic park and garden. And that'll be on the 7th of August. And then on the 21st of August, Sally will be telling us how to record an historic park and garden and write up a research report. Before then, in July, on the date to be finalised, we'll be having an in-person meetup for the project volunteers. And this is going to look more at how to make a site visit and record all the features of an historic landscape. If you haven't already booked, I think Frankie's going to put the link in the chat or send it to you later. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry that was rather lengthy and complicated. We have a few minutes left for questions or comments.
Yes, thanks, Tamsin. That was really interesting. We've got a few questions already, so I'm going to put these to you and we'll try and whip through and answer them. If we do run over a little bit, please just do hang around for a few minutes because we've just got an end of webinar poll that I'd like you all to complete. So do stick around for that. But our first question, Tamsin, was from David, I think. Ari, the glamping site example that you gave earlier, can you say anything about temporary versus permanent effects on significance?
Yes. So I think the glamping was agreed for a number of years, but I think it was a good number of years. I can't remember off the top of my head. So that would have really affected the significance of that area, affecting how visitors could access it and enjoy it for quite a long time. So perhaps should have been considered for refusal. In similar situations, sort of, I don't know, a temporary camp or perhaps a temporary marquee put up for a wedding, that would have a similar short-term effect, but would probably be gone in a couple of days. So you can weigh those up very differently, can't you? But I think the glamping was an application for a certain number of years, and then I think they were going to reapply. So it was almost like a permanent feature and therefore fairly damaging in my opinion.
Interesting. Yeah, the length of time that this will have an effect for. We had another question which was about a specific development, Brunswick Quay in Bidford, and someone was asking what we thought about that being approved, and they've given a link to that in the chat. I don't know if you know anything specifically about that application, Tamsin, but if anyone else wants to look at that, there's a link in the chat there. Do click on it. I'm sure it'll be interesting, because it seems to be a development there that's in the area of a grade 1 listed hotel, grade 1 listed and grade 2 listed terrace. So that's interesting.
Yeah, that is. I don't think I've heard of that one myself, but our planning officers who cover Devon, I hope will be familiar with it. But no, thanks for bringing that to us, and we can have a look at that link.
Yes,
I don't think we've got time to go into it in more detail now, unfortunately.
No. And then we had one other question, which was about what if there was a listed but neglected structure which is not covered in an existing statement of significance, and you want to write a separate statement of significance to draw attention to that structure's importance, significance, or rarity?
Then you absolutely could. Feel free. Anybody could. Even if it's a separate structure, if it's part of a landscape, you might want to write the statement for the whole landscape. Or if it's a really particularly interesting structure, you can just write one for the structure itself. And that statement would probably, or should really include, reference to the landscape that it's in. And then once you've done that, you can very much offer up that statement of significance to your local HER and get it into the system. So absolutely do. Go for it.
Yes. Excellent. Yes, and Sally Bates just commented, I suspect most of our sites will lead to much shorter statements of significance as they're not already on the register of parks and gardens. Yes, I guess that's true.
Yes, I think, Sally, yes, I think compared to Temple Newsome, which is a really complex landscape, yeah, we're looking at probably slightly simpler and slightly smaller sites than that. So yes, don't be terrified. I think it will be quite a straightforward procedure to write up the statement of significance from the research. And don't worry, it's something that comes, the understanding of significance is something that comes as you get to know a site. It's not something that you can sit down and immediately brainstorm and put together. As you do your research, as you visit the site, the significances will pop out at you and they'll become really apparent. Yeah, thanks for that point, Sally.
Excellent. That wraps up all of our questions. I'm just going to launch our poll, which will just pop up on your screens now. If you wouldn't mind just answering those quick questions, that would be really, really helpful. And then after you've completed that, I think we're finished for today. So thank you very much for coming. If you've got any questions at any point, please do send them through to us. We hope you enjoyed today and the whole of the series. And you'll find more information about our future webinars on our website, on our project page. So do take a look at that and start booking onto Sally Bates sessions in August. But thank you very much, everyone. And we will see you in the summer, in July, hopefully.
Thanks
Thank you
for
very
coming.
much. Thank
See you again soon.